What's up, guys? It's Brooks Newton with Des Moines Spine and Sport, here with Luke Ryland of CrossFit 8035, 11th place finisher in last year's North Central region. We just got done watching 15.1, had a chance to kind of talk about the WOD and things that we're thinking about with that workout, and we're going to kind of cover basically our movement efficiency strategies, as well as kind of some mobility techniques to get you through and set you up for success in 15.1, both from a performance standpoint as well as an injury prevention standpoint. So, like I said, Luke, we just got done watching 15.1. Like, what'd you think, man?
Well, they definitely, I think most people thought that things were going to get changed up a little bit.
Yep.
The first portion of the workout is similar to the previous years in terms of movements and standards, things like that. But the clean and jerk is definitely the wrench thrown in this one. So,
curveball,
yeah, for sure. I like it. I think it's a great workout. Definitely going to determine who can maintain their strength and maintain their efficiency as far as technique. And
gotcha. Yeah, so like a definite curveball thrown, I guess, in terms of the movements, like what jumped out at you, what scared you, what do you know you need to work on and prepare for?
Well, in terms of just movements themselves, toes to bar for me personally, that's really, really going to hit the hip flexors and the core. But as far as body parts, like shoulders, man. As an athlete, I see shoulder through that whole thing. So it's definitely a big one to hit.
Yeah, and I mean, a person's shoulders, grip, I think we talked about a grip a lot when we watched it. Me personally, and this has a lot to do with what I do for a living, but I saw it and I thought back and hips, okay? We've got deadlift, we've got the toes to bar. I see a lot of flexion events, or at least the potential for flexion events. Then when we throw in the snatch and basically the finish for the deadlift, and we've got extension events. So when I talk about lumbar spine injuries or low back injuries, I'm thinking flexion and extension events. Those are two movements that can potentially be problematic for that low back. So like with that said, we know we got to prepare the shoulders. We know we got to prepare the hips. So we'll cover a couple things here moving forward. We'll knock out some strategies for both those hips and those shoulders. So I mentioned initially a lot of flexion and extension events, basically potentially tearing up that low back, potentially leading to some lumbar spine disc injuries. My go-to when I think about that is basically a hamstring mobilization, but it also serves as a pelvic reset. So I've got Luke down here basically in a 90-degree position, so he's in 90 degrees worth of flexion here at the hip. What this does is it puts his entire posterior chain on stretch and resets that pelvis in a good position. So that pelvis gets a little bit wonky sometimes when we come in and out on those flexion extension events. Luke at home, when he's going to knock this out, he's going to basically hang out here for about 2 minutes. What he's going to really focus on though is basically pulling his toes down towards his head and trying to smash that little space behind his knee into that wall. Okay, so right now he's probably feeling that for sure lighten up right behind the back of the knee. That's where those hamstrings insert. He's maybe feeling a little bit up in the glute, but based on working with Luke before, I know he's probably feeling most of it behind that knee. So Luke, let's pop yourself up here. We're going to transition to kind of some of that other basically hip flexion work. So I said in the piece earlier, we don't want to neglect those psoas muscles because those are really prime movers with regards to flexion extension of that hip. So Luke's going to show us initially basically a foam roller smash for that hip flexor. So we want to visualize that hip flexor basically making a diagonal from that lumbar spine straight up to the front of the hip. So what Luke's going to do is really work the corner of that foam roller right into basically his hip pocket, okay? And we want to basically just put as much of our weight onto that foam roller as humanly possible, okay? Smash that guy, beat it into submission. That's going to basically set you up for success in that 15.1. So you can see Luke here is actually bringing the heel towards the butt. That's kind of the next advanced stage of this. What I actually like to do here is I'm going to have Luke collapse basically over top of this roller here. And I call it basically an ankle windshield wiper, and he can fan back and forth and almost peel that psoas off the front of the quad here. So really get into that psoas muscle. The other thing that we're going to actually have Luke, you can pop on up here, Luke do is the couch stretch. We're not going to go over that because that's something that 99% of gyms hit on and pound home, and you can look that baby up anywhere on the internet. The last thing that we're going to do, we're going to continue to kind of prep that posterior chain. So we hit basically the door, we call it doorway mobilization, but it's 2 legs straight up that wall. I'm going to have Luke jump down here on that foam roller and hit basically a figure 4 glute smash, okay? So the idea here is, once again, we want to smash basically those external, internal rotators and pelvic those stabilizers of the pelvis there, basically the glute tendons of that hip. So Luke's getting up into a figure 4 position, otherwise like how your dad sits in a chair. And he's going to work basically that knee that's up, down to the floor, peeling off and basically peeling off those tendons of the glute muscles there, off the greater trochanter of the femur, okay? All right, so those are the 4 go-tos that we use basically, like I said, for that hip, that flexion extension of that hip. But then we obviously got to think about the shoulders. So with that snatch, we got to get into that good overhead position. So we're actually going to start with basically a little bit of smashing of the rotator cuff. Specifically, we're going to think about the infraspinatus and teres minor muscles. So those are 2 of the kind of the long forgotten rotator cuff muscles. And Luke's going to actually use this foam roller again. What he's working is trying to get that foam roller right up into the axilla. When you find that spot, you'll know it, but just search around a little bit. So you can see he's basically just raising his arm up overhead like he's asking a question in class, and he's working that foam roller into basically, like I said, that axilla of the shoulder, okay? For those more advanced or that really want to get into that shoulder, there's a barbell routine where you can work on that barbell. I personally can't stand using that barbell because it's too rough for me. So I love the foam roller, but for those that want to really get into there, you're more than welcome to use that barbell. Okay. All right, we just hit that posterior shoulder. Now we're going to go ahead and attack that anterior shoulder. Okay, we obviously want to focus on the structures that are potentially going to limit the amount of flexion that shoulder finds. So we're going to go ahead and use this lacrosse ball. Typically, you pin that lacrosse ball against the rig at the gym. We're using the doorway here because we actually don't have access to that rig. But what you want to focus on is basically pinning down the structures of that pec, the structures of the front of that shoulder. And you can see Luke's basically reaching as far as he can forward to really put some good tension on those structures. And then we want to work into flexion. And then we also want to think about flexion with abduction, okay? Because that's essentially our finished position for that snatch, okay? So with everything we just went over here today, we have to be cognizant about 2 minutes worth of work with each one of these mobilizations, okay? Luke and I were talking earlier, and nobody likes doing mobility work, or for the most part, nobody likes doing mobility work. It stinks, it usually hurts, but get it done. It's really gonna make all the difference for you in these workouts, okay? To be an efficient mover, you have to be mobile. Efficient movers are good CrossFitters. Efficient movers don't get hurt, okay? Put the time in and go get 15.1.